Righteousness. How does one become righteous? The Pharisees had their idea of righteousness. Their idea of righteousness was performing and doing the law. And they set up certain barriers in order not to break the law. Jesus said, "For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses of the Pharisees and teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." So the Pharisees and those of the teaching of the law believed that if they tried to be good enough, they would earn the right to be in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus says, unless your righteousness exceeds that, you ain't going in. Think about it. In turn, Jesus' righteousness has nothing to do with earning the spot. It has everything to doing and putting in the effort in which he says, practice my teachings, not earning, but learning. We're called in that relationship to learn from him. And it's from him we have what is called grace. What they just sang about. We've been trying to use this definition of grace being this, that grace is the ability to live a life that we could not live on our own. That's God's grace. That's every day. Yes, it's unmerited favor that comes through Jesus, but His grace gives the ability for us to live a different life, to be transformed inwardly. And that's what quite frankly, the Pharisees and those teachers of the law. And so Jesus begins that section dealing with one of the most after proclaiming this about surpassing righteousness that we should have, begins in a very clear area of our life, and that is the dealing with anger and holding contempt. He says this anger that's unchecked then produces a couple of things. It produces in us a looking down of another person so strongly that it pursues to the place in which we become God in the other person's life and declare that other person not redeemable. That's why Jesus says, if you're angry with your brother, you've committed murder. You dehumanize the other person. Jesus then turns not only by anger, but to a vital relationship. He speaks of adultery. It's not the act of adultery, it begins in the heart. And Jesus says, okay, desire is good and can be bad. But Jesus says that concerning adultery, that it's not just a passing glance, not a momentary look, but a look that produces an impulse of desire that's cherished and passion is stirred up. The only correction for that in the human heart is Jesus and the relationship in Him and surrender of our will to Him. So this morning, Jesus goes ahead in the sermon and He speaks directly a lot more about the male and female relationship, particularly the most important relationship, and that is marriage. And the way the Pharisees were treating marriage. Matthew 5, verses 31, 32, we read, "It's been said, anyone who divorces his wife and gives her a certificate of divorce, but I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her a victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Divorce at Jesus' time, and particularly was for any reason. In fact, there was a whole school that said even if the wife burns the breakfast, that a certificate of divorce could be given. It was the Hillel school of the rabbis during the time. And a wife could be given a certificate of divorce for anything that was unfavorable to the husband. Anything. But it also meant this, is that the relationship, in this relationship, had to do with personal happiness. You see, if I am not happy, then it can be ended. It puts man's personal happiness above the humanity of his spouse. This teaching was based upon Deuteronomy, the law. Here's the verse that comes right out of the book of Deuteronomy, which is the law. How do you interpret it? If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes a certificate of divorce and gives it to her and sends her away from his house. Those two words that pop up there, displeasing, indecent. You see, the Pharisees were interpreting those two words as anything goes. Displeasing. Anything that the husband would be displeased about, including burning the breakfast. Right? That's how they were interpreting that law. Now, this kills a relationship. You get that? The breakdown then of marital covenant to almost nothing, because any reason could be given to give a certificate of divorce. You see, it may soothe the husband's conscience, the giver, but it didn't change the heart. And it never does. It makes the innocent party to have a stigma of adultery. And even if another would marry them, they carry with them that same look, that same stigma of adultery. Now, Jesus has this discussion with the Pharisees. We read it in the front of your bulletin from Matthew chapter 19. I want us to look at that again. The Pharisees were trying to trap Jesus. And they tried to put Jesus in conflict with Moses. And they asked this question, and this points out the interpretation that they're using of Deuteronomy. He says, some of the Pharisees came to him, testing him, and they asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Jesus doesn't immediately answer that question. What does he do? He points out God's intention for marriage. Jesus says, have you not read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God had joined together, let no one separate. So Jesus says the purpose why God is bringing people together in marriage covenant is not for any reason whatsoever to get divorced, because marriage itself was to be a permanent thing. The marriage relationship was to be permanent and one that unites together. Now, the Pharisees think they got Jesus now, because then they bring about this certificate of divorce thing. And they say this: why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. Let me pause on that thought. Because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. And Jesus says this similarly in the Sermon on the Mount. We read that earlier. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality. It's interesting, the word that Jesus uses here for sexual immorality, it's the Greek word poneia. And it's implied very interestingly to a number of different areas: prostitution, unchastity, fornication, and every other kind of sexual intercourse. Jesus interprets displeasing and indecent those words in the law not for about any reason whatsoever. No way. You see, the certificate of divorce was meant to slow down everything because of what divorce produces. It was to slow down the process. I don't know whether it's the law in Wisconsin, but now there's a law that if a couple was going to go through a process of divorce, they had to go to counseling first and get their papers signed. So I had a couple come. Once to the parsonage to talk to me about their relationship. And as they came in, they sat down on the couch and we got to talking and tried to hear both issues here. But I generally begin with two questions. Number one, why did you come to me? Right? Why, as a pastor, you're coming here? Do you have some religious something or other behind it all? The second was, what I would always ask, is what do you want to happen in our time together? What do you want to occur here? Well, the man told me, he said, oh, well, I'm here to work on our relationship. And her comment was, all I want you to do is sign the paper. Well, I know. Had to tell her, there's no way I was going to sign that paper. And she said, well, she took it out of my hand and she went out, she left. She said, I'll find somebody that'll sign it. The point is not for every and other reasons. Divorce itself, it produces something. What does it produce? Do you realize what the word divorce means? It means hewing off. It means cutting apart. It means like a surgeon who is going to need to amputate a limb, that's the product of divorce. The disciples had a problem with that. They didn't understand, well, if that's the way to take marriage seriously, or this divorce thing, the certificate of divorce seriously, he says, they ask a question. The disciples said, if this is the situation between husband and wife, it's better not to marry. That marriage is serious, and the certificate of divorce is also serious. So their solution to it, well, maybe it's a good thing not to even go there, right? And this is what Jesus' response was. Not everyone can accept this word, only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who are made born that way, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others. And there are those who choose to live like eunuchs, that is, celibacy, for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it. The reason Jesus says for the writing of divorce and this divorcing is for the hardness and callousness of the human heart. Think about that. This attitude of the Pharisee permeates our society. With all this debate in our culture today about marriage. And there are a number of people that are trying to solve that problem in their own way, because whatever they decide to do, it doesn't deal with the heart. Because sometimes the reason for getting married is as ugly and wrong than ending the marriage. One of the situations in which some enter into marriage has no real concept of permanency. They enter into marriage and they have this attitude, well, I'm there and it's going to be easy, so I can walk away and go after other lovers. And they enter with the idea of lack of permanency. But it doesn't change the heart, does it? There's others in our culture today that thinking that if they do certain things, that they would have a permanent relationship, and that is, in our culture today, a lot more couples living together before marriage. Wow, this is a tough subject for me, okay? Here's some thoughts about that. Number one, couples who live together before they get married, a divorce rate of 50% is higher than those that don't. Does it strike you? Here's another. Couples who live together often have the attitude, I can leave at any time, and arguments about my money and your money occur, as opposed to those in the population that are married. Statistics say 60% of couples who live together will not go on and get married, either because they break up, which is 39%, or just continue to live together, and that's 21%. This is a way in which our culture today is trying to solve the permanent problem, the problem of the heart. Another way people have, in our culture, have tried to solve the situation, and that is prenuptials. You've heard of those? You get this agreement on paper, this is my stuff and your stuff, and I'm entering into the relationship thinking that sometime we're going to get divorced, and therefore I still got mine and you still got yours. Doesn't solve it, does it? Here's one that a lot of women particularly fall into before marriage. And it has to do with identity. Individual identity. As long as I'm with that person, that I am who I am. Only when I'm with that person. It's all about what the other person in the relation says I am. Well, that was the problem of the woman that Jesus met by a well. Some of you can remember that story. You find it in John's Gospel, chapter 4, and we have Jesus sitting by a well, and he's talking with a woman that come out there in the middle of the day. Well, it was unusual for her to do that. As he's sitting there, he tells her about a gift of eternal life, water, everlasting, living water. And so she says this to her, or she says to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." And he told her, "Go call your husband and come back." "Well, I have no husband," she replied. And Jesus said to her, "You're right that you say you have no husband. The fact is, you've had 5. And the man you're with now isn't your husband. What you've just said is quite true." The problem this woman was having over and over again is her identity of herself was in relationship to a man. And with each occasion, she's given a part of herself to the man, little heart. And after one after another relationship, and she enters into a committed marriage, there's something missing, right? This woman had trouble with who she was. I'm only somebody if I'm with a man. And sadly to say, we have a lot of that in our culture today. But you know, none of that solves the problem, does it, of the heart? None of this trying to manipulate things and move things around. Jesus says, concerning the certificate of divorce, it came because of the hardness of heart. And they were interpreted for any reason whatsoever, it doesn't matter, that this could be done. There's always forgiveness. Always forgiveness. When a marriage is a with God marriage, becoming equally yoked. And Jesus is not satisfied or not saying that the certificate of divorce is a command. Let me say it again. Because there's always forgiveness in relationship. And hearts can change. There's always forgiveness. No matter what relationship you're in right now. Right now. There's always forgiveness. Whether you're in a second marriage or third marriage or whatever, there's always forgiveness. Devaluing the other person begins with anger. As Jesus said, murder. And reconciliation and relationship is more important than worship. The using of others in a male or female relationship like they're not human and just an object to be used. You cannot be living in the kingdom and disregard and devalue the marriage covenant. It's always about the other person, and it's about unconditional love. If God were the judge and judge your relationship, my relationship, based upon the law of love and living in connection with Him, maybe followers of Jesus would have not as many divorces and a lot more permanence through actually praying together. Jesus and Paul both speak against the cruel putting away and treating a wife or a husband like a piece of property or a slave. That devalues the relationship and makes the other person the source of our happiness. And it really does matter what divorce really means. By the way, and this is the side, if you trying to find your happiness in your spouse, that's a big burden for them to carry. That's a hard burden for them to carry. Expect them to make you happy? I don't know why I'm going there, but I am. If that's your expectation for your spouse, you're making them the source of your happiness. And you and I know, both of us know, that that's not where true happiness comes from. Right? Are we there? True source of happiness doesn't come from your spouse. It comes from Jesus. And to base your relationship and your marriage upon romantic love, so often we'll go into jealousy and possessiveness. And those of you that aren't married, those are singles, it leaves you miserable as you attempt to relate to members of the opposite sex. If that's what it's about, romantic love. It is this type of love, romantic love, that leads lovers to kill each other with both words of bitterness and or even violence. If that's what it's about. The only solution is a surrender of the heart to full, unconditional agape love. That's Jesus. That's Jesus. That's the only. Both in the relationship, surrendered to Jesus, is the only solution to the human heart in these incidents. And that means both husband and wife following Jesus. Following Jesus. This was a tough one for me, because over the last few weeks I've heard more discussions about this. And the Lord didn't know that I was meditating on this passage. And I've heard more discussions this week about relationships in marriages, just hearing people talk. And it's like, Lord, what are you trying to show me? And the only solution for a changed heart in relationship, particularly in marriage, is two committed people to Jesus. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the path of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. May the Lord use this message in every one of our hearts today. May his Holy Spirit, if you are not the committed to Jesus in your relationship, sorry to say, deal with it. That's it. I don't know all your situations. I'm glad I don't. God does. Right? God does. Commit yourself, both husband and wife, to Jesus. Whatever your situation right now is, whoever your spouse is, your relationship is. It's about your heart. May our hearts have surgery done on them this morning and take away the callousness. Let's take this opportunity together. Give you an opportunity to think before the Lord. Allow the Lord, the Holy Spirit, to speak to your heart. And then we'll pray together. Let us bow before God.